They came prepared. A dozen men in high-visibility vests stood inside St. Bridget's Chapel, their boots leaving mud streaks on the old stone floor. They'd brought everything: scaffolding towers, hydraulic lifts, steel pulleys, even a special cradle built to hold priceless works of art. They had moved canvases twice this size, frescoes older than nations. To them, it was just another job. At the far end of the chapel, the painting of the Holy Virgin Mary glowed in the dim morning light. Nearly 6 feet tall, framed in oak carved with roses, the canvas showed the Virgin in a cloak of deep blue, her eyes lowered, her hands open as though welcoming anyone who entered. Time had darkened the colors, softened the edges, yet there was still something arresting about her face. People often said she did not just look at you, she looked through you. The foreman barked an order. 2 workers climbed the scaffold and secured straps around the frame. The hydraulic lift whined to life, gears turning, steel cables tightening. The cradle tilted forward, expecting the weight of the painting to give way. And then it happened. The straps jerked taut, but the painting did not move. Not a shiver, not a creak. Instead, a light spread across the canvas, soft at first, then bright enough to make the men shield their eyes. It wasn't sunlight. The chapel windows were frosted and gray. Yet the Virgin's cloak seemed to shimmer like fresh paint, and her eyes, always cast downwards, appeared to glisten as though wet with tears. One worker shouted, slipping back on the scaffold. Another swore he felt warmth on his hands, even through his gloves, as if the frame itself was alive. The hydraulic lift groaned, its gauge needle climbing, cables straining to their limit. And then, with a sharp crack, the steel snapped free, whipping through the air and slamming into the stone floor. The chapel fell silent. Dust floated in the beams of light. No one spoke. The painting hung exactly as it had before, untouched, serene, her marble, pale face unmarked by the violence around her. Some said it was a trick of light. Others whispered it was divine. But everyone in St. Florian agreed on one thing. The Virgin did not want to be moved. The Virgin Mary painting was more than canvas and oil. Hung on the north wall since the 1940s, it was taller than a man, wide enough to fill the chapel's nave with color. Her robe was painted in deep blue and silver, shadows curling like waves at the hem. Her eyes looked downward, not proud, not distant, but close, as though she saw every soul who dared to stand beneath her. Her palms faced outward, neither blessing nor warning, but something between the two. The oak frame, carved with roses and vines, should have cracked long ago. Yet after 70 years, it looked untouched by age. Parishioners often said it was not the Virgin painted on the wall. It was the Virgin waiting. St. Florian, Kentucky, was not much more than a crossroads, a main street of brick shops, a diner where the coffee never emptied, and a hardware store that still measured nails by the pound. The chapel was its heart: funerals, weddings, Christmas vigils, all under her gaze. But the town had been fading. The old plant shut down, the mill closed, and the young left for cities far away. When developers arrived with glossy brochures, the council listened. Their idea, transformed the chapel into a spiritual retreat and resort. Tourists, jobs, money. In the fine print, small enough to miss on first glance, was one line: relocate existing painting for improved visitor access. At Tony's diner, whispers turned to arguments. Some said it was the chance the town had been waiting for. Others crossed themselves and muttered, "You don't move her, she moves you." After the failed lift, more strange things followed. An architecture student who measured the wall dreamed that night of the painting falling forward, not breaking, but crushing his drawings into dust. He woke at 3:33 a.m., chest tight, convinced the Virgin had looked directly at him. Days later, a contractor slipped on the chapel steps and broke his wrist. The stone was dry, the air still. Yet every witness swore they felt a sudden chill as he fell. The story spread faster than the council could contain them. Some laughed it off as superstition. Others grew quiet, eyes drifting toward the chapel on the hill, as though waiting for the Virgin to act again. By the time the heavy machinery rolled back into town for a second attempt, a crowd was already waiting outside the chapel. They carried no signs, spoke no chants. They simply stood, eyes fixed on the north wall through the stained glass, as if daring the Virgin to blink. Some prayed, some folded their arms. Even those who had argued for the resort now felt uneasy. It was one thing to talk about moving her in meetings. It was another to watch steel hooks bite into her frame. That morning, the sky was empty of clouds, yet the air smelled of rain that never fell. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, Mrs. Keegan, the oldest woman in town, who had lit a candle before that painting every Friday since her wedding day, whispered the words she had whispered for 70 years. "If you save us, we'll keep you here forever." Most didn't hear her, but those who did would carry it with them, because what happened in the days that followed would change not only their town, but how strangers across the country would speak of St. Florian and the painting of the Virgin that would not move. No one in St. Florian agreed on exactly how the Virgin's painting first came to the chapel wall. Ask the older parishioners, and you'd hear one version. Ask the younger ones, another. But through all the half-remembered stories and faded family tales, one truth remained. The Virgin had been placed there as part of a promise. It was the winter of 1947, 2 years after the Second World War had ended. The town was smaller then. A few clapboard houses, a single grocery, a school with windows that whistled in the wind. That January, a storm rolled down the Ohio Valley, unlike any in memory. The river swelled, snow turned to ice, and the people of St. Florian braced for a flood that would wash everything away. The water crept toward the homes on the lower end of Main Street. Men carried furniture to higher ground. Women filled sandbags by lantern light. And then, as suddenly as it came, the storm bent. The wind shifted east, the waters pulled back, and the flood stopped at the base of the chapel hill. Some said it was luck. But for Patrick and Eileen O'Donnell, it was more than that. The O'Donnells had just received word that their eldest son, missing in action in Europe for nearly a year, was alive. The letter arrived on the same night the flood receded. To them, it was no coincidence. It was a sign. Standing in their kitchen, with a pot of stew still simmering, Eileen told her neighbors, She saved our boy, and she saved this town. We owe her our word. We will keep her here forever." By spring, plans were underway. No committees, no architects, no official funds. Just townspeople with hammers, paintbrushes, and faith. An Italian craftsman named Antonio Mancini, once a painter in Chicago cathedrals, had fallen on hard times. He offered his skill for free. In an open-air shed beside the chapel, he painted the Virgin, day by day, color by color, until her blue cloak seemed to breathe in the morning light. He prayed with every brushstroke, whispering words no one else could hear. When it was finished, the town gathered to watch the painting lifted onto the north wall. Families brought stones and tokens, pressing them into the plaster foundation. Beneath the frame, Eileen slipped a folded paper into the mortar. No one saw what it said. Not until decades later, when the edges began to show through the crumbling wall. "If you save our town, we will keep you here forever." From that day on, the Virgin was more than paint and wood. She was part of every life in St. Florian. Couples stood before her to promise marriage. Mothers carried newborns to her feet. Farmers left baskets of corn and apples, asking her blessing on the harvest. And there were the strange moments, the ones people spoke of in hushed tones. A candle burned all night without dripping a single bead of wax. A fire swept through 3 homes on Main Street, but stopped short of the chapel hill. A child wandered from her family during a summer picnic, only to be found hours later, sitting before the Virgin, safe and dry, though the searchers swore they'd checked that very spot. None of it could be explained. None of it needed to be. For the people of St. Florian, the Virgin's painting wasn't just an image. It was protection. When talk of moving the painting spread, it wasn't just locals who grew restless. A small file of emails, photographs, and rumors landed on the desk of Ethan Hale, a journalist for the Courier-Ledger in Louisville. Ethan was known for dismantling ghost stories, haunted houses with mold problems, cursed lakes that were nothing more than bad drainage. He had little patience for miracles. But his editor saw a story in St. Florian, a painting no one can move. Find the truth. Write it up. Kill the myth. Ethan drove into town with a notebook in his bag and doubt in his eyes. He expected a sleepy community clinging to superstition. What he found was different. The townspeople did not try to convince him. They did not hand him grainy photos or force him to believe. They only offered warnings in quiet tones. Don't mock her. Respect her, even if you don't believe. At Tony's diner, a waitress named Carla poured him coffee and said, "Write what you want, hun, but remember, she listens." That evening, Ethan walked up to the chapel. The scaffolding was still in place from the failed attempt, steel braces leaning against the wall like tired soldiers. He stood before the painting. The face was calmer than he expected. Not glowing, not weeping, just still. He took notes, sketched the frame, traced the edges with his eyes. But as he packed his bag to leave, he noticed something. The paint around her eyes shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though a thin film of water had formed there. He leaned closer. The air was cool, the wall dry. Yet her eyes glistened like fresh tears. He blinked, stepped back, and the shimmer was gone. Only paint remained. That night, in his motel room, Ethan woke to a sound. Not a bell, not the wind. It was a low hum, deep and steady, like a voice heard through stone. He checked the clock. 3:33 a.m. The next morning, when he returned to the chapel, the townspeople were already gathered. Men in suits, women clutching rosaries, teenagers with hands shoved in pockets. They were not looking at the workers setting up cranes and lifts. They were looking at the Virgin, waiting, and Ethan, for the first time in his career, felt the smallest edge of doubt. They came back with more. Not just a single lift this time, but 3. A lowboy trailer reinforced for monuments. Fresh cables, thicker than a man's wrist. Specialists from Chicago and Nashville. People who had moved whole spires, entire stained glass windows, even a lighthouse once. The chapel was transformed into a staging ground. Scaffolds scraped the ceiling. Hydraulic cranes pressed against the outer wall. Bright lamps hummed above the Virgin's face. From the pews, the people of St. Florian sat in silence. They carried no signs. They shouted no slogans. They simply watched as strangers hooked steel and nylon to the painting they had guarded for 70 years. The foreman gave the signal. The first lift began. The hydraulic engine roared. Cables tightened. The frame shivered once, no more than the thickness of a hair. The Virgin's painted cloak seemed to ripple in the artificial light. Then the sound came. Not a crack, not a groan of wood, but something deeper. A hum, low and steady, rising from the wall itself. Workers froze, hands hovering over controls. In the pews, a woman clutched her rosary tighter. The machine strained harder, gauges red-lined. The cable snapped like a whip, slamming into the stone floor and throwing sparks. One man fell back, swearing he felt a sudden gust of hot air against his face, though the chapel was cold as winter. The Virgin remained, her eyes lowered, her hands open, her cloak shining faintly in the light. By morning, they tried again. This time, the plan was to cut into the wall itself, free the painting from its plaster prison, and lower it gently into the waiting cradle. The drill whined against the stone. For 12 seconds, it chewed forward, spitting dust. Then it stopped. Not jammed, not broken, simply frozen. The bit refused to turn, though the motor howled at full speed. The second drill lasted even less. Its bit snapped clean in half, sparks scattering like fireworks across the floor. The workers cursed. The townspeople remained silent. That night, Ethan Hale stood outside the chapel. His camera pointed at the stained glass windows. Through the colored glass, he thought he saw movement. Not shadows, not reflections, but a slow glow behind the Virgin's eyes. He blinked, and it was gone. The next day, the final attempt began. 3 cranes surrounded the chapel. Straps looped under the frame. A winch truck growled, its gears grinding. The foreman barked orders through a radio. The crowd gathered outside, more people than ever before, spilling into the grass, standing shoulder to shoulder. At 9:15 a.m., the cables strained. The Virgin shifted, half an inch forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some felt relief. Others felt dread. And then the storm broke. There had been no clouds, no thunderheads, no forecast of rain. Yet a single bolt of white fire split the sky, blasting into the ground less than 10 feet from the chapel wall. The sound was deafening. The air turned metallic, sharp with ozone. One worker collapsed, hands over his ears. Another swore he felt a warm hand press against his chest, pushing him back just before the strike. The cranes shut down. Radios shrieked static. The lights flickered, then went dark. The painting did not move. Her colors glowed in the storm light, her frame untouched, her eyes fixed downward, as if she had seen this battle before. By noon, the machines were hauled away. The foreman muttered about faulty power, dangerous weather, risk assessments, but the crew refused to try again. One man quit on the spot. Another asked to be reassigned out of state. The developers issued a short statement about unexpected technical issues, but no one in St. Florian needed a press release to understand. The Virgin had spoken, not with words, but with light, sound, and refusal. And so the painting remained, exactly where it had been since 1947. The town did not celebrate loudly. There were no parades, no speeches. Instead, candles began to appear at the foot of the wall. One, then three, then dozens. A wooden table was placed nearby, no one claiming credit. People left flowers, folded notes, photographs of loved ones. Even those who had once argued for the resort came quietly, heads bowed, hands in pockets. The promise had been renewed, not by vote or meeting, but by something older and stronger. Ethan Hale, the skeptic, stopped writing his exposé. His notebook filled with something else, lines that read more like prayers than reports. He stayed in St. Florian weeks longer than planned, walking up to the chapel each evening, sitting with the townspeople in silence. He never said he believed in miracles, but when asked why he hadn't left, he only replied, "Some stories aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be kept." In time, the brochures disappeared. The developers never returned. The city council let the project die quietly. The Virgin remained on the wall, her gaze lowered, her hands open, and the town changed. More footsteps climbed the hill each evening. Young couples, teenagers, old women with canes. Some prayed. Some simply stood, staring, listening to the silence. Visitors began to come, not in busloads, but in pairs, in families, in ones and twos. Many took photos. Many more left in stillness, whispering they had seen something in her eyes. The painting never moved. The real miracle was that the town no longer wanted it to. So, if you ever drive the back roads of Kentucky and find yourself in St. Florian, step inside the chapel. Stand before the Virgin's painting. You don't need to believe in miracles to understand why she's still there. You just need to look.